All right, welcome to the, what is it, the fourth meeting of the React Native Utah Group. So this is becoming a thing, which is awesome. We're excited. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you haven't gotten food, just down the hall, there's some lasagna, some soup, a cheese tray. Even if you've already eaten dinner, there's lots to snack on, there's drinks, so help yourself. Make yourself at home with respect to that. Also, if you're not a member of the React Native Utah Slack group, you should join. And there is a link up there for that. Also, some Wi-Fi credentials for the guest Wi-Fi, so you can jump on that if you need internet access. Any other housekeeping items?
Bathrooms.
Oh, yeah, bathrooms are actually down the hall. So we've got this door propped open, just head down the hall. And then, should we start with demos? Should I introduce?
Why don't you, introduce Jose and
Okay.
try to get a feeling for what people want to do, and then
Okay.
we'll give him a few minutes to adjust.
So we're welcoming Jose Jobar, who'll be presenting to us on getting started with React Native. Jose is a recent DevMountain graduate, well, a few months ago. He's currently working for Raven, which is a design and software consulting firm from Utah County. Couple of old friends of mine that started a little while ago, and they actually do work for us. So really great firm. And so speaks highly of Jose and his experience. So we'll be turning the time over him to do an intro in this room. There's also a second meeting room that's also connected to this presentation. Presentation just went black.
No, the monitor's just turned off. I bet it's 7 o'clock.
Oh yeah, you're right. Just turn it back on.
Yeah, the Zoom is still going.
You're still trying to say
Everything at LifeOmic is automated, including when the TVs turn off at night. So
Just hand me that and I'll deal with it.
yeah, okay. The other meeting room is probably doing the same thing. What happened to our meeting? But anyway, so if we don't all fit, there's another room over there that's showing the same presentation that's on the Zoom call. There's also a Zoom link for this. We probably, if Annika hasn't already, we'll drop that in Slack for anybody remote.
It's in the Meetup, actually.
Oh, it's in the Meetup. Okay, so there might be some people remote joining us. Anyway, so no pressure on that. There's maybe 100 people, or maybe 2. I can see from here. It's no more than 5, and at least 2 of them are this meeting room, and well, 3 are you. So anyway, so in addition to this presentation, we're kind of we decided to just for those of us who have a little bit more experience with React Native, we decided to make ourselves available in the hallway, sort of this other room out here. We have a table set up. So if you've got a React Native project and you've got a hard problem that you want to work through, and you might need a second set of eyes, then come out here and let's talk through it. Or if you just want to talk shop and you feel like you've kind of got a handle on how to get started with React Native, then you're welcome to join us out here in the hallway. So that's it. And then as far as, do we want to talk about what people wanted to do in this room?
I think so, yeah.
So there's been some discussion prior to us starting the meetup on what people's expectations are for this. So I think the plan is that Jose is going to do an intro, probably take 20 minutes or so to talk about how to get started with React Native, some of the reasons you might consider React Native, and so on. And then after that, anybody who wants help getting their machine set up to run React Native can sort of stay in here and start working on it, and Jose and others can sort of help you through it. Does that sound like it would be helpful to the group? I see some head nodding. Okay, cool. In that case, before we get started, another thing that we've been doing or trying to get started with this is to reserve a little bit of time before the meetup for people to just demonstrate React Native apps that they're building. So I understand somebody has an app that they wanted to demo.
Okay.
You? Okay, yeah, so come on up and, you can join the Zoom meeting.
He's already done that.
Oh, you're already set up. Okay, cool. We'll just turn it over to you then.
So you'll probably need to stop sharing so he can share.
Okay, yeah, we'll make, the Zoom dance, we call it. So introduce yourself, tell us about your app, and share it. And then after you're done, you can turn the time back over to Jose, and we'll go from there. So
okay, I don't have anything prepared, but Hi, my name is Jake Wilson. I work for this company called Everyone Social. We're in the SaaS employee advocacy software space. That's just a fancy word for me and my company built an app that's basically like Slack meets Facebook meets Reddit in a way. So you can go on to the app, you can create groups and share content, and it's about the goal of the product is helping employees grow their social networks and connect with people in their organization. So.
You can put it right there. Jose moved his. So.
Cool. So, all right. So I built this app using the Expo framework. So after you log in, you land into a feed that's an aggregation of all of the groups that you're a member of. So, so basically, through the application, you can create groups and subscribe to them. So this is the screen where you can follow various different groups. So if I click on this one, see if the thing working. All right, so I'm using Lottie for the check box, for the check animation. So when you go to follow stuff, most of our animations in the application use Lottie, and it's worked pretty well for us. There's been some interesting cases where, so we use Apollo and GraphQL for all the data. So when you're consuming this, Apollo, GraphQL, and all React stuff. It's been a lot of fun. So if I want to view this image, there's a way to view content. Let's see, I can zoom in. My keyboard's being weird. You can also save it. Let's see here. So then I can click into here, and this is like the viewing post experience. I can comment. So and then. So there's some cast synchronization issues there, but so there's like the little loading animation, and then so generally what we'll do is with Apollo. So like anytime we go to write, we use this thing called an optimistic response. So we know what the data is going to look like before it syncs with the server. So anytime we write, we always have optimistic responses. So everything feels like it's happening immediately, and then there's some stuff we do to manage the synchronization after it comes back from the server. So here, when I can go and like on something, so then when the Apollo cache updates, you can see how the label says you and Jason Brandon whether like this, and if I unlike it, it syncs to say you didn't like it or whatever. Let's see here, there's some other stuff we've done. We have this section called people. So this is where you can go and find people to follow in your organization. So if I follow Derek, then my feed of content will include everything that Derek posts. Let's see here, so we got like a bunch of tabs. This is our production account, but we also use it for testing. Let's see here, and then search applications. Then we have search as well too. So if I it'll just populate what's suggested. If I look for let's see here, so I look for Dan. Dan's my boss. I'm getting back all posts from Dan. Our backend uses Elasticsearch to index all of our content data. Here, so I really like this animation that pops down when it slides and stuff. I'm getting more into the React animation stuff. That package was a lot of fun. Let's see here. So the other thing that's interesting too is that on our GraphQL backend, we use this thing called subscriptions. So effectively, any data that we want to be real time, we can create a subscription for it, and it'll be real time. So anytime a notification comes in, that's coming down over. So our subscriptions on AWS use this protocol called MQTT. So if you like a post, generally, if somebody likes my content, that change will propagate down to my client in roughly, it's usually under 100 milliseconds. It's just MQTT is lightning fast at delivering that. And yeah, I think that over the course, I got some graphs too. Let's see. So I think the axes on these, so they still need a little bit of work, but it's been pretty fun. We're using, I think it's Hero Charts is the open source library. It works on web and React Native, so I can go over to the web guy, and if he's already figured out some stuff with the chart, we can actually just kind of collaborate there to make building charts and visualizations a little bit faster. Let's see, and then so a lot of our goals of our product is getting you to share content out of the app. And so this is just like there's like a flow for suggested content that we want you to share. So if I pop on this, I have like my social accounts paired to this widget. So you can hit share on that. And it's like kicks off the share flow. And our backend for the share, because it has to proxy LinkedIn and a couple other places, it's kind of slow. But then we have this like toast that pops down. But yeah, I think that's oh, and that is my dog. So yeah, I mean, does anybody have any questions, comments?
What are you using for navigation?
React navigation. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's been fun. I was a mobile. I did Android for a number of years, and going from Android to this has been like night and day difference in terms of my productivity and just fun that I have with developing in React. So.
Is it just you building?
So I built the initial. I worked on it for 5 months, then I hired someone, but his focus is more like do the backend stuff, and then he switched over to doing more native because we have things going ways where we need more backend features and we need more native features, and he's a really good resource to work on both. So his skill set's pretty diverse. Yeah, but yeah, so the core stuff, I spent a lot of time just analyzing whether or not we could actually use Expo. That was a couple week project, just figuring out if like it would actually meet the needs of the product. There's been a couple times where we've like needed to bring in libraries that depend on npm, some core npm thing that like Expo just doesn't like. But up until this point, it's worked really well. I think the hardest part that I ran into is I couldn't get the deep linking working on Android, and I had to go in and decompile the APK that Expo produced to figure out like what it was doing inside of the manifest for the deep linking, and that was the depths. I mean, that was like the deepest thing I had to do to like go in to actually make it all work. But yeah, other than that, I've been super happy with Expo. It's been interesting. I've looked at Flutter, and I looked at Flutter quite a bit too, and I don't know, I'm back and forth on the whole like you get awesome performance in Flutter and everything's static. Like so, I use TypeScript and optional typing, and sometimes getting the types to line up, and you know, some maintainer doesn't have their type definitions updated, and it's just a big kind of pain. But so Flutter being like static Dart is kind of nice. But yeah, so any other questions?
So when you say there's a night and day difference between the creativity, the how fast you can work, how different you can work, I know you have several years in Android background. We go back.
Yep.
So,
yep.
And I know a little bit of your experience, what you were telling me about React Native. So how is it different now that you're in the thick of it?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is that like you get declarative UI in React Native out of the box, and now there's a bunch of frameworks that come out for Android that are like trying. I mean, there's even one called Litho that's from Facebook that's trying to kind of like bring that declarative UI approach to front end. I used to write a ton of code in Android that was like, you know, find this text view, set the data to it, and then when some function calls something somewhere in this class, like changes, then it's just all this super chatty code. But with React, it's just your data is like the data is the representation of the UI, and so that's one thing that I've. But it all doesn't come for free. So what I did is, because when I started off doing React Native stuff, I just hopped into it, and I was like, oh, I know Android. This won't be a problem. It'll work just fine. And I didn't actually dive into like the component APIs and like what, you know, the difference between pure component, regular component, and when it's actually going to trigger an update. I remember seeing in my logs, it would say, hey, your flat list and your feed is taking forever to update, like it's slow or whatever. And I didn't notice it to the touch, but then when I did it, I didn't go full audit on this feed. And I basically had to go in and find all the components that could be pure component and all the ones that couldn't, and the ones that couldn't, making sure that their update cycles would only update when they absolutely had to squeeze out all the performance of it. That's one thing that's I learned kind of going through this. But on the surface of it, like React seems very simple on the surface, but there's the internals of it and like what it's actually going to like do can also get really complicated really fast too. So we've gone through. The one thing that I want to move towards. React has a thing called hooks. So right now we have in our code base there's points where we have 6 higher order components just to do one component, and so I'm been waiting for months for Expo to update the React Native core so we can actually use hooks, and that's one thing that I may end up detaching from Expo to do, because it's yeah, like I really just want to use hooks because it's a lot better than this mess of hierarchy components. And when one of the hierarchy components fails, it's a bear to chase down because.
That's a really good promo for next month's
Okay.
React Native Utah meetup.
Yeah.
It's about hooks.
Yeah.
June.
Yeah, hooks are great. They definitely simplify a lot of things. And if you look at like what the render tree that's produced from hooks is like way less complicated than what's actually rendering with HOCs or even just nesting render props or whatever and stuff. So,
Garrett, did you bribe him to say that?
oh, yeah, definitely pro hooks. Yeah, does anybody have any other questions? Cool.
Anybody else have a demo they want to do?
Awesome. Well, thanks for letting me present. This is a year of work that I kind of just had in my head, so it's nice to actually like show someone that's not a coworker. So.
Thank you.
All right. Let me share my screen again. All right, perfect. Well, hi everyone. Once again, my name is Jose. I'm really happy to be able to present to you today React Native. Like Derek said, I graduated from Thin Mountain about a month ago, and I started working with Raven. I've been working with Raven for about over 4 hours. So Thursday, so I'm really happy about that. And
We won't ask you if you like it yet, then.
yeah, I recently jumped into web development. It was an idea that I've been evaluating for years, and finally decided to take the dive. And so I'm really happy. I feel like a fish in water. So I recently started working with React Native. Someone gave me like a challenge, a code challenge, and started playing with that. And I saw all the potential and how awesome it is to develop for mobile. And it's relatively simple. It's not as hard as it seems from the outside. And so when Aaron asked if somebody wanted to present, I gave just 10 minutes to see if somebody wanted to volunteer, and then decided to offer to take that task. And so I hope this presentation can really help you get started. React Native there's a lot to cover when we talk about React Native and mobile development as a whole. And so this presentation will just scratch the surface, but hopefully with this, you can get the basis to get started on your first project. And so that's my goal today, just to present to you why React Native would be a good choice if you're still evaluating, if you're from a company and you're considering it, or you want to kind of know a little more about why React Native is such a great tool like everyone is talking about. Also how to set it up, how to do the setup for React Native for Mac, for Windows users, and if you're going to be working on iOS and Android, we're going to try to cover what are your choices with that. And also learn just a few key components that React Native comes with, and kind of how the difference is if you come from the web development world and you're diving into mobile, what are the key differences between what React and React Native do. And finally, if we still have some time, we can just kind of jump into how to do debugging, because it's slightly different when you try to debug your app with React Native.
Maybe what we should do, Jose, is let you cover those first 2 points and stop and see who literally wants to go out and set up their machine, and they can leave the room and go work on that with the...
Yes, that would be great. And feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, and we can try to tackle those as we go. All right, so first question is, why is React Native a better choice? And one of the reasons why many people is jumping into React Native, especially new companies, but not just new companies, but also companies that have been working with mobile for a while, are deciding to jump into the React Native boat, is because you can do almost pretty much the same as you would be able to do with native apps that are developed with Android, or I'm sorry, with Java, or following the I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping myself here. Hold on. Yeah, so basically, you can just develop mobile apps using JavaScript and React. JavaScript is really popular nowadays. Is a language that many people is using nowadays, and React is also a really popular framework out there. And so many companies and many people see the advantages of developing mobile apps just using React, and letting React kind of handle those conversions, or compiling those differences to iOS and to Android under the hood. And so that's a big advantage. So you can build cross platforms for Android and iOS using React Native, which from a savings standpoint, as if you were kind of overseeing this, like on an investment point of view, you could come up with a product that before you would have to have two teams, one working with iOS, the other one working with Android. You can now have one team working on an app that could technically work on both Android and iOS. So one team developing one app that would work on the two different platforms for mobile. Another reason why React Native is a good choice is because there's a large community, and not just from React Native developers, but also React developers that are constantly contributing, because this is a free software. This is open for everyone to contribute, and so a lot of people is constantly sharing plugins, sharing libraries, trying to make this a better tool for everyone. And so that is this framework has been basically tested in battle, and it is gaining a lot of popularity, and which is why it's just, to my opinion, it's unstoppable, and it's just gonna keep getting better and better. And so it's just like a no-brainer, just to see the reputation of this framework and all the companies that are using it. It's definitely something to consider when you want to jump into developing with React Native. Another thing is hot reloading, and so for people that has been developing mobile apps, kind of the old school, we can say, they kind of appreciate the hot reloading. Now that you can start developing your mobile app and then just save your changes and see almost instantly the difference, that is something that they really appreciate. If you come from web development, that doesn't seem like something like a big deal, but for mobile development, that is definitely a big deal. Another thing is over-the-air updates. This is a feature that you also have access to. So if you already published, or if you already launched your app in the App Store or Google Play, and you want to do some changes, there's a bug, you could do an over-the-air update, meaning that you can upload your changes to the cloud with a service that is offered. I think it's called Code Push, and there might be another one, but I think I forgot. And you can make those changes, upload those changes, and they can be immediately sent to the users without having to go through the App Store, which is a tedious process as far as I've read. You kind of need to get permission if you're posting a change to your app. The App Store needs to review it and approve it, and then it's then transferred to the end user. So with over the air, you kind of take the middleman out, and you can just send those changes directly to your users that have the app installed on their phones already. All right, so we're going to talk about setting up React Native and what are your choices if you haven't done this before and you want to kind of start playing with React Native, and can be a little bit overwhelming. Overall, if you've looked in the documentation page for React Native, there are two main options that are presented there. One is Expo, and the other one is just React Native CLI. So we're going to try to cover those two. And like I said before, we're going to try to cover the differences for Windows, Mac, and Linux users. And so first, we're going to talk about Expo. So the documentation page, this is a paragraph that they say that this is the easiest way to get started with React Native. If you're just trying to dip your toe, if you're starting to dip your toes into React Native, this is the best way for you to start. Expo tries to handle the complexities of setting up the environment for you to start development for mobile. So this is the equivalent of Create React App, and it was actually called Create Native React Native App before, but they just recently changed it to Expo. So Expo is formerly known as a Create React Native App. So some reasons why you wouldn't want to start with Expo are that there's still many APIs, that, especially native APIs, that are not compatible with Expo. And so there is a feature request board that you can check. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Jake.
Like Jake was saying, one of those features that are still not compatible are React hooks. So you'll see that in the request board that is still pending, I think, as a feature that has been requested that they're working on. Another big one is Bluetooth. So if you do want to have, if you want to be able to use Bluetooth for your app, then Expo is not the best way to go. It is still an API that is not compatible with Expo as of yet, but they're working on it. Another thing is the size of the files is fairly larger than if you were not using Expo, just because it comes with many libraries that you might not necessarily use. But it's just like a package that you either use. You don't have the option to kind of narrow it down, so it is fairly larger compared to if you were not using Expo. And another thing is that you cannot work with custom native components. So if you do have a previous app that you developed for iOS or Android, you kind of want to add some new features with React Native, then Expo is probably not the best way to go, just because there's no way to get those two connected. There's some libraries like that you use CocoaPods to connect them with, and the Expo is not compatible with CocoaPods. All right, so the next couple of slides are just like the steps that you will need to follow if you want to get Expo installed in your computer. So the first note is that you need to have Node installed, version 10 or plus. And then once you have that installed, then you can just, from your terminal, whether it's a Mac or a Windows, you just run the npm install, and you do a global install for your Expo CLI. Somebody want to follow the steps? Right?
I think what we should do is like go through the different options, and then people can say, oh, I want to use Expo. Okay, go over there with Parker and he'll help you do that. Or no, I need Windows and I can't use Expo, and we'll send you to someone else like that.
All right.
Well, does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So after you install Expo, then the next step would be for you to go to the directory where you want your project to live in, and from there you would run the Expo init, and then the name of your project, and then after you finish that process, which I'll dive into a little more in the next slide, then you just cd on that directory, and then you just do an npm start or Expo start. And so after you do the Expo init, you're presented with this screen. It asks you which template you want to install, and you're presented with three options: blank, tabs, or bare minimum. So blank is, like it says here, it's the minimum dependencies that you can have installed, but it's not the bare minimum. That's the third one listed there. I personally, when I did my first test with React Native, I did blank. And I kind of jump into some things, like for instance, I didn't have Jest, and I wanted to run some tests on my app, so I had to install Jest because it didn't come with that. Then the next one, tabs. The difference is that it comes with 3 screens that are already pre-made with React navigation, so you can kind of see how that works and see the code, kind of understand how React navigation is laid out, the code for that.
So it's a tab bar controller with 3 tabs.
With three screens with using React navigation, yeah.
Okay.
And then the bare minimum is like, if you do want to use Expo, but you want to skip all the limitations, that you would use bare minimum. And based on the documentation, what I've read, there are no issues or limitations if you were to use the bare minimum setup. All right, so after you do the Expo start or the npm start, you get this screen from your terminal. And so you get the QR code that you can scan, and then all of the other options below. So you have the option to scan this with your phone, the QR code, but you need to have the Expo app installed. Whether it's, if you have an Android or an iPhone, you have that Expo app available for you to install.
Does it work again with iOS? Because it didn't a couple of months ago.
It works for me. I've tested it.
Okay.
For both Android and iOS. It worked.
Okay.
It worked for me. Another option would be for you to run an emulator or simulator, which are the same thing. It's just Android call them emulator, iOS they call them simulator. If you do want to have an emulator or simulator, you do need to have the Xcode for iOS and Android Studio for Android. Expo is more straightforward. The only problem with that is that you do need to have a Mac to install Xcode. So if you have a Windows computer, that's something you just can't do. And then with Android Studio, you need to install the SDK for Java, and also the Android Studio, and the steps are it's a little bit more complicated. You need to follow other steps, and you might run into some other like glitches along the way or problems along the way, but it is fairly easy, we can say. Another option is that you can send yourself a link to your phone, and with that link, you just press the link, and from the app that you already have installed on your phone, the Expo app, you can launch your project. Or you can also sign in. You can create an Expo account and sign in from here. So, yes.
Sorry, not really a question. I just wanted to point out, if anyone's following along and they saw you'll need Xcode, Xcode is huge. It takes a long time to download, so probably don't try to do that in the context of this meetup. You probably won't have time to download the whole thing.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to mention, Xcode is fairly big, so it's like 7 gigabytes of space that you need to have available. And if you want to install Xcode and Android Studio, you probably need to have about 8 or 9 gigabytes free in your hard drive to do that. So it's a lot of space, that's for sure. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, it takes quite some time to get Xcode installed. So the next one is React Native CLI. And first, we're going to talk about some reasons why you don't want to go with React Native CLI. This is a more advanced setup. With Expo, like I was saying, it takes a lot of the complexities from the initial setup. With React Native CLI, you're on your own, and you kind of need to follow those steps to do the initial setup yourself. Linking and integrative requires more configuration, but it's gives you more freedom of what you want to have installed and how you want to have it installed, and it's more compatible with native code. So if you have another project that you come in with, you want to integrate it with React Native, then React Native CLI is the best way to go. The initial compiling is also slower than Expo, but it's usually just the first time, as far as I've seen, that is slower, but it is fairly slow for both iOS and Android, but it's just for the first time. So these are the steps for if you're using a Mac. For you to get started, again, you need to have Node installed. The documentation recommends for you to have Homebrew, and then from Homebrew you can install Node, both Node and Watchman, which is another tool from Facebook to kind of keep track of changes on their directory files. So you need to install those two, and these are the 2 steps that you follow for that. And once you have those 2 installed, then you can run the npm install and do the global installation for React Native CLI. And so if you do want to have Xcode installed so you can run the simulator, then you just follow the same steps to install Xcode, which is just go to the App Store. You can download it from there. But again, yeah, it takes a long time. Once you have Xcode installed, you do need to follow this other step. You need to go to the preferences and install the command line tools from there. If you're not using a Mac, and well, this is basically for both Mac users and Windows users, or even Linux users. If you do want to work with Android, then you do need to, like I said before, install the Java DSK and Android Studio. And the steps are really detailed, so I just decided not to include them here. Just go to the page, to the getting started page, follow those, whether you're using a Windows or Mac, and just follow the steps from there. And it's fairly easy. I followed them myself and didn't bump into too many issues. And so once you have all of the dependents, the pre-required dependencies installed, you just, from your terminal, you just run the React Native init. It's a similar process for Expo. You have to be in your directory where you want to have your project saved into. And then after you cd into the directory, then you just do a React Native run Android or run iOS, depending on what you want to work with. Other options for you to get started with React Native are Snack. Snack is kind of like a code sandbox for React Native, so it's pretty cool. You can create a React Native project from a web platform without having to install anything on your computer, and you can run a simulator from the web platform, and you can pretty much see it running from there.
Go through your presentation and then we'll publish it.
Great. All right, so I want to show also some basic React Native components. This is, again, for someone that hasn't never worked with React Native, it's catered for that purpose. So if you have used React on a web development environment, then you'll know that probably when we're talking about JSX, the component we can say that you use the most, or the element that you use the most, is the div. So for React Native, what you will use the most, almost like as much as you will use a div for React, is the view. The view is what you will use to wrap most of your components in your render. And so it is decided to be nested. You can have multiple divs nested as well. I'm sorry, multiple views nested as well. So this is just an example of kind of how it looks, a React Native component looks like. You have a view that is wrapping all of the other elements inside, which are 2 other views and a text.
Oh, can I make a comment on the last slide?
Sure.
Yeah, so one thing when you're building out these render functions, one thing you want to be careful is instantiating new objects either in like the data or in the style, because what happens is every time that render function gets called, it's going to create a new object, and then JavaScript will do a composition between when it's diffing the render tree. It'll say that like, oh, this is new. It'll like trigger a render. So I wrote 4 months of code that had styles like this, and I had to go back in and do style sheets for everything. It was the biggest pain in the butt refactor that I had to write. But yeah, it's like a subtle thing that like I didn't notice, and after like working on that for a while,
So you wouldn't recommend inline styling?
No, just because due to the diffing, just due to how it's going to diff. And 9 times out of 10, it's like you're really not going to listen to performance, but at the core, again, like that's like what it's going to do at runtime. So
Great to know. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, so the next one is text, and obviously text, you'll use it to add text to your view, to render. That's what you'll see on the screen. The main difference with text with React Native is every text that you are going to add to your component needs to be wrapped within this text component. And you can also have nested text elements. I think I have a screenshot here. Yeah. Well, these ones are not nested, I think. Oops. Something I wanted to point out with this screenshot is that styling in React Native is different. So you do see something that is similar to CSS, but it's not really CSS. It's just something that React Native, the developers for React Native created to make you feel like you are styling with CSS, but it's not really CSS. It's an illusion. And so one of the things with text is that if you're used to font families, to adding font families to your projects, and you have like 2 or 3 different fonts, that doesn't work with React Native. And so the recommendation is that for you to made or pre-made some text depending on how you want them to be styled. So in this example, you have like the main or the default text that is my app text. But this other my app header text has been styled specifically as a header. So it probably has it's an H1, it's got a specific color. So you have to pre-make those different text components and then just use them accordingly in order for you to add the proper styling to those. The next one is touchable opacity. And there's touchable opacity and touchable highlight, which are kind of similar. And so these components are really useful if you want to customize a button, because with React Native, the button component, it's the native button component. So there's not much styling that you can do. But if you do want to customize your buttons and add maybe an icon and change the color and the shape, then you will have to kind of customize your buttons, and for that you'll use the touchable opacity. So I have an example here. So this is pretty much kind of how a button would look like. You'll have the touchable opacity that handles the on-press action with a function, and then inside of the touchable opacity, you add an icon if you want, text. And then you can add any particular styling that you want to add if you want to change the color or whatnot. And then styling, I kind of jumped ahead of myself. It's like I was saying, it's kind of like CSS. And so the best way to style, as far as I've seen with React Native, is through objects. And there is a component for that you can pull from React Native that allows you to create objects that you can then pass into your elements in your render with the different styling. Like say if I have a button, then I'll create an object for a button with the different stylings that I want. If I want to have text, I'll do the same, and so on. And yeah, I added the inline styling, but I didn't know that is a good observation.
Yeah. The other one too that was a gotcha is so sometimes you get like an optional style, like say it's checked or not, or it's red or it's blue. There's a function on style sheet called flatten. So you call style sheet.flatten and you pass in an array of styles. And then the last one in that array will take precedence. So if like you had a background color in the first style, and you had a background color in the next one, the one on the right would be the one that takes precedence. Oh. So that's another one that I've like had to refactor on to like, just take a bit more performance out of it. So.
Cool. Yeah. And style components, if you're familiar with style components, is a very popular framework or library for you to add styling to React. And so it is compatible with React Native. And so for some of you that might be familiar with that, that is a really good advantage. And so this is an example of the styling. If you were to use style sheet, which is the component that comes with React, you would just import it, and then you create a variable. In this case, is const styles, and then you define. This example is just a container. This is kind of the only element I want to style. I call it container, and then I pass it along here into my view.
So this is what you'd recommend.
Yeah, style sheet created.
Yep. And so yeah, you just designate it here, and then I added the inlines here just as an example. That's something that you can also do. Yep. All right, and for my last the last thing I wanted to show you today was the debugging tools. And for this, I wanted to do it more like a showcase, not necessarily a presentation. So I have an app. This is a really small app. This is the first one I started working with React Native. And so normally, when you first start working with React Native, you just run into some questions like, oh, where's the console log? How can I console log something here? And so for that, if you are using Expo, which is the case for this app, you can do Control-Command-Z from your simulator, and then it brings up the developer menu. And so from here, if I want to run the console kind of from a web development environment, then I do the debug remote.js. And this should bring up browser somewhere. Sometimes it jumps on a different screen, which I don't like. Let's see. Let's try this again. Let's refresh, actually. All right, so I guess it doesn't want to come on for some reason. Let's try this again. All right, well, I get that going. The other one I wanted to show you is the toggle element inspector. So if you hit toggle element inspector, you can inspect specific sections from your app. So if I want to see information about my search bar right here, I just click on it, and then it gives me all this information, the height, width, kind of how you would see that from the developer tool in your browser. And then for touchables, you also have the option to select that. Yeah. So you can select those touchable elements. So when you select touchable, it highlights only those elements that are obviously touchable, like it says here. And so you can select those and then get all of the information up here. And so if I want to see, for instance, search field, also normally when you select one, you jump into the, it will take you to the code for that specific thing that you're clicking on. Right now it's giving me a hard time. But yeah, so if you would play with this too, element inspector or debugging, which is not running for some reason. Do you know why you think it's?
I don't know. Let me see what it does. So for the record too, the element inspector is super buggy. I run into problems with it all the time. When I can get it to work, it's nice, but like there's times when it just is like, yeah, right, yeah, exactly. So
yeah, another option would be for you to install the React Native developer tools. I didn't include it in my presentation, but you can find more information on that. You can install it on a standalone, and it's kind of its own window that comes up when you run it.
yeah, that's what I use. I would like that one quite a bit too, but I think it's kind of chatty going. I always have a billion browser tabs open, so I always lose the browser tabs. So I happen to like desktop apps pretty nice too. So.
Yeah, but basically this is my presentation. Do you have any questions?
So how long do you think it would take to be a craftsman in React Native?
It depends, like, first of all, like, have you worked with React before? If you have not worked with React before, it might take a little bit longer for you. If you do come from a React background, then it might be fairly easier for you to catch on. And it also depends on the complexity and the app that you want to build, but if it's something fairly simple like this one, which I didn't really show you what it did. Let me show you this one. So I made this one like in 3 days, and I've never worked with React Native before. So this is a search. Oh, come on. All right, so if you want to look for something, let's say, I want to find a bike, I just type in bike. Or
What API are you using to get the data?
It's fixed data that I have.
Oh, nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, I didn't use an API for this. So yeah, I did use the flat list, which is another topic I didn't cover in my presentation, but with flat list, you can, it's the best way for you to go to show lists on your app with flat list. You can set like how many columns you want, and you can also limit, like, oh, I'm gonna show 4 items at a time, and I want to do like what was it called, like
Pagination.
unlimited,
Or, infinite scrolling.
Infinite scrolling. That's the one. Yeah. So I made this like in 3 days, and so I mean, depends on your background, but I feel it's fairly easy to catch on. And it's fun, actually. I really liked it. I enjoyed it. So
all right, well, thank you.